Eighth order of business, Senate Floor Resolution, Senate Resolution 8618. The Secretary will read.
Whereas on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized the United States military to forcibly remove and incarcerate more than 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, including 12,000 Japanese American residents of Washington State. And whereas the first civilian evacuation order gave Japanese Americans from Bainbridge Island, Washington, less than 1 week to leave behind homes, personal belongings, farms, businesses, friends, and family, and report to detention centers like Camp Harmony on the grounds of the Washington State Fair in Puyallup, and hastily converted horse stables house the evacuated families. And whereas these detention centers were temporarily quarters for the evacuees, while the United States Military Department constructed 10 mass incarceration sites for Japanese Americans located in remote inland areas of the United States. And whereas this drastic policy of removal and relocation allegedly aimed to prevent acts of espionage and sabotage by Japanese Americans who were deemed untrustworthy and disloyal to the United States. And whereas on March 23, 1943, the War Department organized a segregated unit of Japanese Americans, many of whom reported for military duty from the concentration camp surrounded by barbed wire in which they and their families were detained. And whereas more than 12,000 volunteers responded to question their loyalty and patriotism by amassing a battle record unparalleled in United States military history, with a casualty rate of 314% and earning a collective 7 Presidential Unit citations, 21 Medals of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, 588 Silver Stars, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, 22 Legions of Merit medals, 145 Soldier Medals, 9,486 Purple Hearts, 16 decorations from France and Italy, and in 2010, the Congressional Gold Medal. And whereas equally loyal and patriotic Japanese Americans fought to protect our constitutional rights and liberties through dissent, like University of Washington student and Auburn native Gordon Hirabayashi, who was arrested, convicted, and imprisoned for defying a military curfew on select civilian and refusing to evacuate when ordered. And whereas in 1982, the Congressional Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians found no military or security reason for the internment of persons of Japanese ancestry, but determined that the cause of the incarceration is racial prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. And whereas through the travesty of injustice, Japanese Americans suffered immense economic loss of property and assets, experienced immeasurably physical and psychological harm, as individuals and collectively as a community, and were deprived of their constitutional liberties without the due process of law. And whereas in 1979, Washington State Congressman Mike Lowry introduced H.R. 5977 to provide reparations and an apology to Japanese American incarcerees, thus initiating a 10-year legislative quest that ended when President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And whereas throughout Washington State, the last remaining survivors of the European and Asian Pacific battlefields of World War II and of American incarceration camps lived their golden years in quiet contrast to the extraordinary acts of conscience and valor, while all the Americas continued to benefit from their heroic patriotism. Now therefore be it resolved that the Washington State Senate pause to acknowledge the 81st anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066 to recognize and remember Japanese American veterans, incarcerees, and civil rights activists from the state of Washington, and to reflect on and honor the lessons, blessings, and responsibilities of the phrase, with liberty and justice for all. And be it further resolved that copies of this resolution be immediately transmitted by the Secretary of the Senate to the Nisei Veterans Committee, Denosho, the Japanese American Citizens League, the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Washington State, and the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience.
Senator Hasegawa.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for adoption of Senate Resolution 8618.
Senator Hasegawa has moved that Senate Resolution 8618 be adopted. Remarks, Senator Hasegawa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, I want to thank this august body for allowing us to remember what happened 81 years ago. And I think it's very appropriate that we do it on Children's Day because they are actually the reason that we have to reflect on what happened so long ago so that it never happens again. And I am truly blessed to be here with my granddaughter, Keiko, and her mom tending to my granddaughter. But, you know, my parents, my grandparents, my uncles, aunts, my whole family basically was incarcerated for no crime they committed. It's just because how they looked. And they spent a serious portion of their life behind armed guard and barbed wire, even though they were American citizens. And as you can see by the resolution, they had something to prove. They were American citizens. So many of them volunteered to serve in a segregated Army unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And they went on to become the most decorated Army unit for its size in the history of the U.S. Army. There are some amazing stories, but every bit of the way, they were always very cognizant of what they were there to do. They were to prove that they were American citizens, and they fought for freedom and our Constitution. Some of the war stories that you hear, I've told some of them on this floor in the past, but one that stands out is one from Senator Inouye, who I'm sure you will remember. He was the most senior senator in the U.S. Senate until he retired. But Senator Inouye was involved in one action where they were charging a machine gun nest up on a hill, and he remembers going up that hill, and they actually, even though they were far outnumbered, were taking the hill. And he looked into a machine gun nest and saw a young German sitting in that machine gun nest, just terrified. And it dawned on him that he really wasn't the enemy. He was just there because his country called him. But that he had this epiphany that we're all humans. Why are we fighting each other in such a way? And that story stuck with me. And it makes me realize why we are all human. We all have different ways of viewing the world based on our past experiences, but we all deserve the right of liberty and freedom and the right to live as we wish to live without harming others, of course. So when we look back on the events of Executive Order 9066 that President Roosevelt signed that incarcerated my entire community, the struggle that the community went through to make sure that the liberties and freedoms of our Constitution are preserved for future posterity, and President Reagan ultimately signing the Civil Rights Act, Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which recognized and acknowledged that egregious error in our judgment as a country. But it also proved that our country is great enough to recognize when we make a mistake and acknowledge it and apologize for it. And from there, we can move forward together. So there are so many egregious things that have happened in our country that we need to stand up and acknowledge and apologize for. Not just to my community, but there have been so many oppressed communities throughout our country's history. And that is the point of remembering every year, not just what my community went through, but what many communities go through. And I hope that we take this moment, and I thank you. This was a serious test for many of the young kids, I know, to sit through the entire reading of the resolution. And thank you for your indulgence. but it is very important that we remember what happened so that it never happens again. So with that, I appreciate your support for this resolution.